Welcome to the EXCELcast. I'm Jonathan Kuuskoski, Assistant Director for Entrepreneurship and Career Services at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And today I'm here talking with Jeremy Peters of Ghostly International and Quiet Scientific Records about challenges and opportunities in the music industry today. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, thank you.
Great to have you.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with the challenges. So I think one of the things that we deal with is that students quite often think that they face challenges sort of specific to their area. So classical pianist has particular challenges, whereas a jazz trombonist has totally different challenges. So how would you characterize challenges? Do you see that they're all individualized, or are there common challenges that you see cutting across sort of the world of music and the music industry?
I guess I would say that I feel like they kind of cut across the entire music industry. I work in popular music, but I also sing classical music semi-professionally on the side. And those same kind of challenges are in all sorts of fields. There's a couple sort of specific ones that I guess I would mention. One is the ability to sort of create a funding methodology or a stream of income for yourself. And that's difficult in all sorts of fields that musicians come to. The other is sort of the ability to find your voice as an artist and a creator and a musician, and also trying to figure out a way to connect with your audience.
Great. So in other words, there are perhaps individual challenges that we all face, but sort of common challenges are sort of things like finding your voice, building sustainability in your career, and positioning your work with an audience.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we can all relate. That's great. That's a great example. So how do you deal with these challenges in your role at Ghostly? You're Director of Music Publishing, right? So tell us a little bit about that role and how these challenges play into the work that you do.
Yeah, definitely. At Ghostly, we try to find our artists early on in their career process and try to work with them to build their audiences sort of from the ground up. It's almost grassroots in methodology. Obviously, we're there to invest in them and help that pathway be a little bit easier for them maybe on the financial side of things. But we'll invest in their touring careers, we'll invest in their, and we don't make any money off that necessarily, but it helps grow them as an artist. We'll invest in we'll put resources behind them to market, to press, and to radio, and we'll put resources behind them to connect directly with their fan base, and sort of help them put a structure behind them to collect royalties from all different sorts of sources, and try to have that sort of basis for them to do. But there's a lot of things that we do that really anybody could do on their own. It just requires work, and I think those sort of same things come about all across the music industry from what I found.
Wow. So it sounds like your relationship at Ghostly and Ghostly's relationship to artists is kind of different than what we sort of assumed in the 20th century, right? Where artists would sign up for a deal with a record label, and that may not have much, they may not provide a lot of support beyond recording and distributing the album. It sounds like you're actually, I don't know if the 360 deal would be an appropriate way to describe it, but you're certainly seems to be involved in supporting and wanting to nurture that artist in all aspects of developing their craft and their music.
Yeah, definitely. I would say, we don't take royalties off of 360 of what they're doing as a business person or artist themselves, but we're definitely helping them build that their personal and artistic brand from the sort of 360 standpoint. And many times we sort of act as a de facto manager for artists who are smaller and haven't been found by a manager yet, and sort of find them managers or find them booking agents, or at least give them the resources to be able to find those places, which all helps. Specifically for what I do music licensing and music publishing, so I'm trying to get them in TV shows and video games and commercials, and working to grow their entire artistic career and get them press and radio and get them awareness in that field helps me do my job.
Oh, I see.
Music supervisors can find it because the director or the producer of the film demonstrates interest in the band. That happened with a show called Silicon Valley on HBO, actually. The director came to the music supervisor and said, "I like this artist, we should license them."
Interesting. So you mentioned this one particular example. What are some other examples of your time at Ghostly, ways that you have addressed these particular issues in a particularly innovative or a different way, or a way that might be particularly interesting for those aspiring to go into the industry?
So we've done some interesting events. We tend to work with visual artists as well as artists who are just doing music. And we've sort of tried to figure out ways to meld those by putting together events. We did an event called Art and Artifice, which featured a visual artist named Matt Schleien, who's from here in Ann Arbor. Actually is part-time faculty at the university, but who does paper folding. And his work alongside other visual artists that we work with. And then created a series of talks with them and had our artists perform and also do a series of talks where they're explaining their craft and the sort of creativity behind their craft. And it sort of brings a different viewpoint and is not necessarily something that a standard record label would do. They'd be focused on, putting out the poppiest record possible. We have, for instance, artists like Kiln, who's based here in Michigan, who has never played a live show and often takes 5 years between records. Not necessarily things I would suggest to most artists if they're trying to get started out, but by incorporating them in talks instead of having them play live, because they don't necessarily know how to perform their music live at this point. We've been able to shine a little bit of light on them, and they've seen some music licenses actually, I'd say, hopefully because of those.
Interesting. So one of the common things that I hear all the time about income earning is that it's hard to earn income. It's one of the biggest challenges that all artists are facing. And some of the things you commonly hear are things like, you can't earn money from streaming. CD sales or album sales also really can't make money from that. And then you hear stories about, well, touring was the last bastion of income earning, and even that is not possible. So I'm just curious from your experience, because you've done different projects, obviously with the intent of kind of shining a light or helping artists craft a better relationship with particular consumers and to nurture those relationships. So how are artists earning income? How are they building that sustainable model, at least the ones that you work with?
I'd say they're working trying to take any pathway that is available and trying to, figure out some sort of financial incentive to work along that pathway. Whether it is, some of our artists have worked and created their own kind of musical instruments and sold those as a side income stream, or other artists are visual artists themselves. Tycho and Muxmool on Ghostly are also visual artists themselves and have sold their drawings or sold their graphic design as a way to sort of create and I know this has been likely mentioned in other EXCELcasts, but a sort of portfolio career. You can put together your live performance, which might not be enough money to necessarily support you, and your record sales and your streaming and all of the other sorts of royalty streams that might come in through music publishing or all those things, and sign up for enough of those things with the help of your manager, or if you're able to do it by yourself, and kind of put together enough different separate royalty streams and income streams that you can essentially create a living from it.
Interesting. So there's this question of the portfolio career, and I'm glad you brought it up, because we all seem to be living that to a degree. Some people live it within one job, but most performing artists seem to have these multiple activities that both create income earning opportunities, but also help craft their unique sort of identity in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And it seems like artists today are really as comfortable as ever, if not more comfortable, with blending across genres and not necessarily defining themselves by discipline or by one type of musical style.
Yeah, I think I'm a great example of that. I work at I co-own a record label that focuses on independent pop, indie rock and indie pop. I work at a record label that focuses more on electronic and left field pop music, and then I also sing classical music, which is, written by Thomas Tallis and William Byrd from 15th century. So kind of those strange connections, and in some ways there's things that fit. There's musical groups that are based on, the example of Roomful of Teeth comes up because they're from originally came out of Yale's Institute of Sacred Music, but ended up performing really modern classical music in non-standard settings, and working with a record label that called New Amsterdam Records, based out of New York, which does stuff in the new class or nouveau classical sort of realm, and then also is doing pop music, and we've done shows at their new venue in Brooklyn, which I'm forgetting, the National Sawdust, I think is the name.
Yeah, that's great. So speaking of this, let's get into your story a little bit. So how did you end up working at Ghostly? Did you just, did you intern there? Did you just call them up? What happened?
So I had the benefit of having a friend, and I guess this may be sort of a Cinderella story, but I had a friend who is the art director for the label who I went to school with. He knew that I was interested in the music industry. He knew that I sort of had started a little label for my brother's band, and so knew that I had a little bit of background in the music industry, but I was finishing up my degree in music and political science at the University of Michigan. And had sort of I was thinking I was going to move to Washington, D.C. and maybe work on the Hill. I was really interested in politics at that point. But then it ended up seeing an ad that Ghostly had placed in the Michigan Daily, of all things, looking for an intern. And so I responded to it, and sort of through my friend who worked there, and that process met with Sam, the owner. We began talking. And then he offered me an internship. They had, at that point, were doing a decent amount of music licensing, but didn't have anybody else to focus on it. So I started there, interning while I was going to school full time. And then my last year of school, I actually went back to part time because I was pretty close to finished. So the entire year I worked part time as a part time employee at Ghostly, and then part time was a student at the university and finished up my degree while all that was going on, which wasn't easy. Was working, also at the university. So essentially 2 jobs, going to school. There's, I guess another common theme is there's going to be times like that where you have to sort of work through less than ideal situations, but usually there's a payoff at the other end.
Right.
And through that process, ended up learning on the job how to do music licensing, but was also doing digital distribution and doing sales and physical distribution, and got a real nice backing, I guess, in the music industry that ended up helping when my brother and I and a friend of ours from New York decided to start putting together our own record label.
Yeah, let's get into that too. So one of the takeaways from this story, I think, is being willing and open to opportunities without necessarily knowing what the long-term outcome is, and to be curious enough about an industry or an opportunity to dive in and get some experience. And also to understand that, I think in our minds, especially when we're in school, we think about starts and stops, the start of the semester, the end of the semester, graduation. But a lot of times, professional student life ellipse, right? It's not, there's no finish line where upon graduation, there are people handing out jobs. So finding that...
You go into college thinking that, and that's not the case.
Yeah.
You learn really quickly that's not the case.
Right, and there are those periods that can be critical, right, to get on the job and learn things that could actually help you craft and create a space in that organization based on your strengths and what you can bring to it.
Now, I essentially built my own job, and now there's 2 employees in just the music publishing division, going from being, a part-time intern to, getting paid essentially minimum wage, and sort of built that part out myself. And wasn't easy, but, that kind of go-getting attitude, I think, is helpful. And it's the same thing that fueled us building our own label.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You are co-owner of Quite Scientific. So, and you mentioned a little bit the difference in the focus between that label and Ghostly. Tell us a little bit more about how that started and what the activity of the label is.
Yeah, definitely. It essentially started, my brother and a friend of his, they knew each other from Lansing, and there was a great music scene sort of around there in Ann Arbor of artists who would never fit necessarily on Ghostly. Ghostly might have been a little too left field for them, and we sort of decided, that we had a background in the industry. I'd sort of learned how a label operates and sort of how the income streams kind of work. Obviously didn't know everything, but had enough friends that we could ask favors for, at least for our first release, that we were able to find a distributor and a digital distributor. Our friend that ended up living in New York, he was the music director at the college radio station at MSU, WDBM, and turned that into working as an intern and then getting a job at a radio promotion firm in New York, which he was able to cash in to get promotion for, instead of getting a bonus, he said, will you do work our record for free, essentially. So kind of figured out the quid pro quo, I guess, that you can sometimes do in the music industry. You can't necessarily do always in the corporate world. But we basically realized that the artists were there, and the artists were the ones that pushed us to actually put this together. There were so many great bands that we thought weren't getting enough focus, and so we tried to put together what was originally planned to be sort of a collective, I guess, of bands that were friendly with each other, that were, had that Midwestern sort of work ethic, were willing to kind of put in the time just as much as we were, because this is something we're doing. I work full-time in the music industry, was coming home and then working for another 4 hours, crazy enough as that sounds, to try to put out records from these other bands because they deserved to be put out. And now 60-plus releases, and I think nearly 10 years later, it's still going, and we've had bands that have been upstream to Warner Brothers, and bands that have been in commercials and sort of been able to tour the world in the United States. And it's been really great to see that these artists who are focused from here, just around here in Michigan, and we've expanded since then, but that original group of artists was able to kind of spread and be loved by the music community in general.
That's great. So in a way, you've kind of crafted your own identity as an entrepreneur by paying forward and trying to help other people. Love that outward message.
For a long time it was, still to this day we don't pay ourselves very much, and it's rare that we pay ourselves. We usually just plow the money back into the business to be able to, we're able to support ourselves with other things, and if something goes really well, we might cut ourselves a small check, but it's more about being able to put out more records and try to help be a artist incubator in some strange ways. I think that's one of the main things I learned from Ghostly, is that investing, as expensive as it may sound, on the front end of things, whether it's with education or it's with learning and getting an internship, I think that investment can have a big payoff later, especially if you're able to roll that investment back into doing bigger and bigger projects.
That's great. So before we run out of time, we have a lot of students here at Michigan, both within the School of Music, Theater, and Dance and all across campus, who are really excited and interested in the idea of working within the music industry. So, whether a student is thinking, I want to work in an established label, or I want to start my own label to help support the artists that I believe in, what are a couple of takeaways that we could send to them about the things that they should be doing? Let's say they've got sort of minimal experience and they want to get their feet wet.
I'd say it's not necessarily as hard as you might think it is to necessarily put together something, especially from a label standpoint. We obviously had a little bit of luck. We started with $3,000 and a little bit of luck and some experience, and a lot of hard work to start Quite Scientific Records. I'd say if you can find internship opportunities, we'll leave it up to the Department of Labor whether or not you get paid for those internship opportunities, but the idea of getting an internship and investing yourself into that job shadow and that ability to learn from just being in an organization and doing what they're doing, and learning how they go about getting royalties and how they go about booking shows, and trying to really strive to work and find those opportunities can be beneficial. And I think also maybe wouldn't necessarily call it job shadowing, but asking questions of your friends who are artists, who are, a little bit more successful, about what sort of things they did to get there. Whether it was hours in the studio, woodshedding and learning how to perform their instrument, to things that they learned from other artists about promoting themselves, or ways to present themselves as a musician. I think that can be really beneficial. There's also a lot of resources here on campus. The EXCEL program at the School of Music obviously has a ton of them, this videocast being one of them. I teach, and there's a whole series of classes under the arts admin category that are about building your career, building your portfolio career, I believe is a class that you teach. I teach a class on the recording industry, and a second class on entrepreneurialism and surrounding music projects. I forget what the title of the class is off the top of my head. And there's also a student organization that's being put together called Maze Collective and Hail Records, and we're hopefully going to be turning that into an actual class where you can work at a record label and hopefully get credit for it. And even if we're not able to turn that into a class, I'm going to be the mentor for that student organization and kind of have a place where people can turn to on campus to find resources. You know, there's a ton of entrepreneurial resources that the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovate Blue has, and say investing your time in those would be worthwhile.
That's great. So there are a lot of exciting opportunities available and more coming online soon, which we're really excited about. And thanks for the plug for Excel. We're so glad to have you teaching with us.
Yeah, it's an honor.
Well, their students have benefited so much, so it really is for us too. So thank you so much for coming in here to talk to us today about the music industry.
It's my pleasure.
And look forward to talking with you again.
Yep, thanks for having me.